Good evening all. Thank you for joining us on our penultimate event of the year, which is an update on the fire safety legislation. We are just in advance looking at a December event, which we're hoping will be an in-person event, and currently we have the date of the 13th of December penciled in, and more information will be released on that shortly as we can confirm the details on that, so please do bear that in mind. Main point of today, though, is to hear from Lauren's update on fire safety legislation. As you can see, Lauren's actually a colleague of mine. She's one of our consultancy services deputy managers. She's also our fire service lead within the organisation. And currently, Lauren is, I think she's already in the hundreds in terms of people she's speaking to about providing briefings on the fire safety legislation, so the Building Safety Act and Fire Safety Act. So it's with great pleasure I'm going to hand over to Lauren, who's going to provide our update on fire safety. Lauren, over to you.
Thank you, Greg. Thank you, Julie. Evening, everyone. As previously mentioned, I'm a consultancy services deputy manager here at Assurity Consulting, and I also head up the fire safety services within the business. So now the fact that you're all here attending this webinar means that you're aware of the mountain of changes that have occurred recently in the fire industry. So my goal is to give you a brief overview of the Fire Safety Act, the Building Safety Act and Fire Safety England regulations, and what we expect to happen in time to come, and hopefully give you a bit of an insight on what you should be doing already and also how you can prepare for the future. Unfortunately, it will be brief as I can only touch on so much in my allocated time slot today. But casting your minds back, we need to cover, just going to quickly cover the RRFSO, because you need to have a fundamental understanding of this to then understand the Fire Safety Act. So, as you probably are all aware, the RRFSO, basically, it replaced most of the fire safety legislation that we used to have and brought it all under one simple order back in October 2006. So now the onus is on the person who has control of a premises, and they must take reasonable steps to reduce fire and make sure people are safe in their buildings. There are 5 parts to the RRFSO and 53 articles. So the main articles which relate to the practicalities of fire safety management within a building are within Part 2, which is all about the fire safety duties. So the meaning of responsible person, this is the main term used for fire safety management. And the responsible person is in relation to the workplace, can be the employer of the workplace and anyone who has control over a premises. So they can be the occupier, so you're a tenant, you are the responsible person for that space within the building, or if you manage a building or if you own a building, you are the responsible person for those parts. So there can be multiple responsible people within one single premises. So the main duties, as I said, in Part 2 of the RRFSO, I think we're all up to speed really in terms of fire safety management, what's expected of us. So we must have a fire risk assessment as detailed in Article 9. We must provide fire safety training to our staff and also fire safety instructions to our visitors, contractors, members of the public if they are to come into the premises or even in the surrounding area of the premises. So that those instructions can be displayed on fire action notices and detailed within fire evacuation procedures. Must conduct fire evacuation drills. The terminology for the frequency of drills is at least annually. So we need to make sure that we're covering shift patterns of people who are coming into our buildings and who occupy our buildings. Must consult and implement any recommendations of the local fire and rescue service, who are the enforcing authority of the RRFSO. We must conduct routine fire safety inspections and informal checks to make sure that our escape routes are clear, our fire exit doors are not obstructed, and making sure that the means of firefighting provision and detection within our buildings is suitably maintained. So, as I said, the Fire and Rescue Service are the enforcing authority, and they may issue a number of improvement notices. Now, hopefully you haven't had any of these, but if you have, hopefully you've learned from them. So the prohibition notice basically means stop what you're doing. You either can't occupy the building or you cannot continue as you are because there is a danger to life. An alterations notice may be given if the fire authority think that you need to make changes to your work activities or the practices, or even structural changes to your building. And enforcement notices kind of capture all of their other recommendations. So they may require you to have another fire risk assessment carried out, for instance, because the one you have may not be deemed suitable and sufficient. So real quick run through of the RFSO, but it's really important when we come to the Fire Safety Act. So, Fire Safety Act, cast your minds back a few years following the Grenfell Tower tragedy in 2017. Dame Judith Hackett delivered an independent review of the current building regulations and fire safety between 2017 and 2018. So the main focus was on multi-occupied high-rise residential buildings because fire safety legislation for those premises was minimal, if not non-existent in comparison to commercial workplaces where the RFSO applied. So off the back of this review came the Fire Safety Act. So the RFSO previously only focused on commercial property, and it's also why this legislation does not extend to Northern Ireland or Scotland, as they have their own fire safety legislation. I will come on to that a bit later in the presentation. But the Fire Safety Act reached royal assent back in April 2021, but it was enacted in England and Wales recently. So England was May this year and Wales was end of last year. So essentially what this piece of legislation now does is it clarifies the scope of the RFSO to make it clear that the responsible person for multi-occupied residential buildings now need to manage and reduce the risk of fire spread with, regarding their external cladding, walls and structure, as well as their fire doors. So the scope of this legislation is where a building has two or more sets of domestic premises. So that could be flats, that's halls of residence and boarding, or domestic dwellings. So the building structure and external walls, including doors, windows, anything attached to the external walls, balconies, solar panels, also condenser units, plant equipment, and the common parts within that building, the RFSO now needs to apply to those areas. It must also apply to doors between domestic premises and common parts. So the Fire Safety Act is not only focused on the 4,000 high-rise residential buildings that we have in England and Wales, but all residential properties now, or all properties that contain two or more sets of domestic properties. So this could be as many as 1.7 million properties that fall under the catchment of this change. So under Article 9 now of the RFSO, the fire risk assessment must now capture those areas as on screen. So your structure, your external walls, doors between domestic premises and common parts. So following on from the Fire Safety Act, I also want to draw your attention to this new PAS document, which focuses on assessments called fire risk appraisals for external walls. So this PAS document is not designed for buildings under construction. That's where the Building Safety Act comes in, which I'll touch on in a minute. And it's not to be used to put blame for historical building works. So this is essentially the methodology and the process for analysing the fire safety risks and fire spread on external walls and structures. It's been implemented as part of the government's aim for a common sense approach to external wall reviews. I think here in Britain we're very good at panic buying. So after Grenfell and the cladding issues, everyone went out to try and look for an external wall survey. We don't have the resource across the country to allow for the number of surveys which people are requesting. So the requirement now falls to the fire risk assessor. And basically the process is for the fire risk assessor to have a look at the building and ask them, like, what's the risk of fire spread in relation to the external facade? Now, if it's a low risk, so low likelihood of fire spread, it might be just constructed of brick or concrete walls, there's no balconies or anything, then great. They just need to document that within the risk assessment and we move on, no problem, all done. However, if they feel that there is a moderate risk of fire spread, they may recommend that a specialist fire risk assessor have a look at this. So if they feel that that they'll come in and have a look and may have a look at your external walls and say, actually, I don't think there is a moderate risk. They may sign off and say, all good, here's your evidence, and you've got that evidence going forward. There's no further action after that, rather it's just to keep that fire risk appraisal of your external walls under review, and there may be some management recommendations to be made, but the risk is deemed acceptable. Now, if the fire risk assessor is not sure, we may not have the expertise in understanding or identifying facade, because there are certain layers to the facade. It may look like concrete on the outside, but it may be a polystyrene mix. They may make a recommendation to carry out an in-depth technical assessment. Now, this is what you would expect of an external wall survey. Now, the specialist may review it and say, actually, you're okay, it's not combustible, the risk of fire spread is actually tolerable, and manage it similar to the previous step. Or they may make recommendation to carry out some form of further investigation and action to reduce the overall risk. Now, this PAS document does touch on the fact that fire risk assessors are not expected to have the competency to carry out in-depth assessments of external walls. So they're also looking at adding in some professional indemnity insurance. But what they don't want is every fire risk assessor to try and cover their backs and say you need to go and have some further investigation. So now moving on to the Fire Safety England regulations. Sorry, let's move on here. So these regulations, they come into force on 23rd of January next year, which is only round the corner. Now, these regulations were made under Article 24 of the IIRSM, which is still in Part 2. And this article is essentially the power to make regulations about fire precautions. So power to make additional regulations. Now, these regulations basically impose new duties onto the responsible persons with regards to the areas defined in the Fire Safety Act. So that's your external walls, your common areas and your doors that go from the residential spaces into common spaces. And they implement the majority of the recommendations that were made in the Phase 1 report from the Grenfell Tower inquiry. So you'll have to bear with here, this is where we start getting to height thresholds. So for high-rise residential buildings, again, this is still for buildings that have 2 or more sets of domestic dwellings within them. But these buildings now have to be at least 18 metres in height or 7 more stories, whichever is reached first. And these 7 stories include basement levels as well. So if your building falls into this scope, you have to share electronically with your local fire and rescue service information regarding the external walls and the construction of your external walls of the building. And you also need to provide electronic copies of floor plans and building plans with the fire and rescue service. Now, they don't want architectural drawings, they want simple floor plans. And these floor plans and building plans ideally should be printed A3 and laminated and then kept within a secure information box. Now, the regulations call these boxes secure information boxes. You may also hear across the industry the term premises information box. Now, the fire and rescue service try and use the term premises information box because if you have a box on the side of your building with secure information box written on it, you're kind of asking for someone to go and investigate and potentially vandalise your property to try and get with it inside. So within this premises information box, it needs to be on the outside of your building, located by the entrance, must be well signposted, and it must contain details of the responsible person, contact details, and those building plans. Also within the building, you need to have wayfinding signage. So this is basically if the fire and rescue service were to come out of a firefighting lift, they need to be able to easily identify flat numbers and which floor they're on. And it's the same within the protected stairs as well. And lastly, any firefighting equipment that you've got installed within your buildings, that's firefighting lifts or evacuation lifts, they now need to have monthly checks carried out. And if any lift is out of service for over 24 hours, this must be notified to the fire and rescue service. So this regulation was due to the fact that a 65-year-old woman who had severe arthritis was housed in Grenfell Tower because it had an evacuation/firefighting lift within it because she couldn't negotiate steps herself. However, at the time of the fire, the lift was out of service and unfortunately she died on the 18th floor. So moving down in height for multi-occupied residential buildings over 11 metres in height, the responsible person now must undertake quarterly checks on all communal fire doors. So they're the fire doors within your protected stairs, within lift lobbies, basement areas, plant spaces, and annual checks on flat entrance doors as well. And then in all multi-occupied residential building, regardless of height, so that is essentially all buildings that fall under the scope of the Fire Safety Act, you must provide relevant fire safety instructions to residents. This also should include how to report a fire, how to report any defects, and also provide them with instructions and information regarding the importance of fire doors and fire safety. Now, the goal here is to provide better communication between landlords and residents and also provide residents with a better voice and a louder voice. If you need any further information regarding all of these regulations, there are some really useful fact sheets as well on the government website. So there's a fact sheet for each of those regulations that I've spoken about. So they're free PDFs and it goes through the purpose of the fact sheet, what they're going to do, and why they're making those recommendations. So moving on to the Building Safety Act. Now this is a huge piece of legislation, so it's going to be key points here. This reached royal assent back in April this year, and again for the buildings in scope are the higher risk buildings, which are residential properties with 2 or more domestic dwellings. So the same as the Fire Safety Act. However, there is now a height threshold for the Building Safety Act, and that is the building must be 18 metres or 7 stories high, whichever is reached first. So this isn't just residential properties, so this includes hospitals, care homes, hotels, prisons, boarding schools, halls of residence, student accommodation, but that height threshold still applies. Now, the Fire and Rescue Service are still lobbying for a reduction in height to 11 metres. So if you're not entirely sure as to whether a property that you manage meets the requirements for the scope of the Building Safety Act, but it could be argued either way, then I would strongly recommend you start to implement the requirements, because it's likely that down the line it will fall into the scope. There are new roles and responsibilities imposed by the Building Safety Act, and they fall quite nicely in line with CDM regulations. So we've got the client, principal designer, principal contractor, and contractor. So it's a new stringent regime. It places the legal responsibilities on all of those individuals who have some means of control over a high-risk building, all the way from design stage, all the way through to occupation. So there's really nowhere to hide. So we've then got the accountable person. There's a new duty holder. So we've now got the responsible person. There's now a new duty of the accountable person. This can either be the organisation or person who owns or has responsibility for the building. It may also be an organisation or person who is responsible for maintaining the common parts of a building. And it's also important to note that, you know, when a building is being refurbished, it may actually involve multiple duty holders. So you may have the principal designer, you may have the principal contractor, but you'll also have an accountable person because the building may remain occupied during a refurbishment. So if the building has more than one accountable person, then the person responsible for the structure and the exterior of the building is known as the principal accountable person. And when buildings have just a single accountable person, they will be the principal accountable person. So moving on to their duties, they must prevent building safety risk. So in the legislation, this is defined as spread of fire and structural failure. And then if an incident does happen, they are responsible for implementing reasonable steps to reduce the seriousness of it. They must register all buildings with the Building Safety Regulator between April next year and October 2023. Any buildings that fall into the scope of the Building Safety Act that aren't registered with the Building Safety Regulator by October next year, it will be an offence. So the Building Safety Regulator is the HSE, so they've taken on this role. They will regulate high-rise buildings. As I said, so these are buildings with 7 or more stories or that are 18 metres or higher and have at least 2 residential units. They will be responsible for preparing the safety case report to the Building Safety Regulator on request and assisting through the gateway process, which I will come on to. So they must also create a resident engagement strategy, including a complaints procedure, as I said, to allow for better communication, must share important information, such as the fire risk assessment. They must maintain the golden thread of information in digital format, which I will come on to, and prepare building safety cases. Now, there was an additional role for a building safety manager, but this was scrapped as it meant that the residents couldn't be charged for the appointment of an additional role. So the roles of the building safety manager have now been absorbed into the accountable person duties. So I have a couple of PAS documents here regarding competence and additional responsibilities. They are free PDF copies, so if you do have any principal designers, principal contractors and want to know the framework of competence, they are easily accessible. But with regards to the principal designer, the HSE has requested for 2 principal designer roles. So this will be split between principal designer and principal designer building regs. So the latter will then liaise with the building safety regulator, the HSE, for gateway approvals. So some examples of new duties for the principal designers are to highlight gaps in building information and suggest intrusive surveys where there are gaps in construction elements or construction methods. They assist in submitting planning permission, which is copied to the building safety regulator. They receive approval from the building safety regulator to move on through the gateway process. They must refer to the building fire risk assessments as whole building fire arrangement. So even when they may be working on a small refurbishment in part of a building, they need to look at the entire building, especially when it comes to compartmentation, to make sure it's not affecting anywhere else in the property. They also must take into account the vicinity of neighbouring buildings and make sure that all design requirements and suggestions comply with building regulations all the way through delivery and over to handover to the principal contractor. And these are their new roles as well. So they contribute to the planning and development of construction plan and must demonstrate that that construction plan complies with building regulations. They liaise with other duty holders, so the client, who may be the accountable person. They must liaise with the principal designer to understand their obligations and assist with the signing off of key information, so as-built drawings and fire safety information. Similar to their duties currently, they also must ensure that everyone working on the construction site are aware of their duties. They also assist with maintaining that fire safety information as part of the golden thread, so making sure that it's maintained digitally, and must establish a robust system for mandatory reporting of any additional hazards and contribute to handover of information to the accountable person once we get to occupation. So the golden thread, I'm sure everyone has heard this term. So what is it? It's essentially the information storage to allow someone to completely understand how the building operates and how to keep it safe. I think we've all seen how easily it is for key information to be lost when a building changes hands. So this has been designed to kind of prevent that. So it must be held all the way from design stage through construction and all the way to occupation. And it must be stored digitally. Now, as you can see there, I've mentioned BIM, which is Building Information Modelling, or ISO standard 19650. So there was a new British standard that came out regarding the management of golden thread. There's been a lot of questions in the industry as to how we expect this to look, because it's all well and good having these wonderful goals of, you know, having accurate evidence and information storage and being able to easily extract that information upon requirements as well. This golden thread is supposed to support the safety case approach. So whenever you go to the building safety regulator to move through your gateway process, they will be asking for the information in your golden thread, hence why it has to be digital. So moving on to this British standard, don't think that the government are going to give us a step-by-step process of what this is meant to look like, because we're not going to get that. It needs to be industry-led, and also it needs to work for you, your organisation and your building. So this British standard came out about a month ago, I believe, and as far as British standards go, it's not too bad actually. It's quite a good document, and it focuses quite a lot on there's no requirement to use the BIM format or an ISO format. It is applicable to both new and existing properties, and this standard introduces a process as known as information exchange for fire safety information. So as you can see there, there's loads of stages in terms of a building or assets life cycle, all the way from briefing to design, construction, handover, occupation and end of life. But we also need to take into account when a fire incident occurs, we need to be providing information to the fire and rescue service as well. So I've taken this from the standard. If we look in the middle of the diagram, it's focusing on people, environment, business operation and the asset itself. So they're all the key aspects that we need to be looking at. On the outside, you can see the key stages that I mentioned. On the inside, those little swirls, they depict the times throughout the building's life cycle of when information is handed over. So you think about every time that you have to pass information to an individual about a property. That may be when you're having a fire risk assessment carried out, or when you've the fire authority are coming to inspect, or you've had a fire within the premises, so the fire brigade turn up, you need to give them information, you need to give information to security, to your residents. So that's kind of showing the life cycle and the amount of times that we need to be sharing information. So a lot of what should be in your golden thread you already probably have. So, you know, your high-level fire policies, your procedures, your roles and responsibilities, your organisational targets in regards to fire safety management, to asset information, so your fire strategies, your drawings, your O&M manuals, fire risk assessments and trend analysis of any incidents. And then we've got project information, so if you're going for a refurbishment or any construction, so schedule of competencies, updates regarding use of materials that are used, and also site plan, so showing what fire and rescue service facilities are in place, what firefighting provision you have within the building, and your maintenance records and schedule for all of the life safety equipment that you have within the building. So you probably have all of this information already, and it's just making sure that you've stored it within a streamlined process that's easily accessible. So some key points to probably take away and probably have a think about. As accountable people or persons, it's up to you as the accountable person for that building as to how the what the golden thread looks like and how you want to manage it. So some hints and tips is using standardized and consistent terms when you're saving information. So rather than use the term fireproof, make sure all of your contractors, your designers, O&M manuals, everything may be saved termed fire resistant. So you can type into your system fire resistant and everything will come up. Trying to avoid duplication of information, digitalize everything. So if you have hard copies of anything, scan it and save it. Develop a responsibility responsibility matrix as well. So who's responsible and accountable for the information, who is managing that system to make sure that it's consistent, and developing a simple workflow to show how the information is shared. So if we take a simple example of Legionella bacteria, for instance, what is the communication pathway and escalation procedure for detecting Legionella within a water system? You can apply the same approach to your fire safety information. Who does the information go to? Then where is it stored and how is it shared? So moving on to the gateway system, there are essentially 3 gateways in which a building will need to progress through all the way from design stage to allow for occupation. So this is going to be regulated by the HSE as the building regulator, and they are the only ones who can grant progression once they're happy with the information provided in your golden thread. So gateway 1 is the submitting to the building regulator at planning permission stage. So this is managed with your principal designer. They must provide planning information and drawings and a simple fire statement to include the evacuation procedures or proposals for at design stage, and how the fire and rescue service are meant to access the property whilst the building is under construction. And the building safety regulator need to know who the accountable person is right from the get-go, right from gateway 1. So then moving on to gateway 2, this replaces the building control deposit of plan stage. So this is your pre-construction. Construction hasn't started yet. Before building works start, information such as plans and proposals for compliance with building regulations need to be provided to the building safety regulator, and you must be able to demonstrate duty holder competence here. So I refer back to your PAS documents for the principal designer and principal contractor competence, but also providing evidence of competence for the accountable person as well. There are a couple of different approaches you can take at this pre-construction phase. You know, you can have a staged approach for more complex properties, and the building safety regulator basically will come and inspect all of your the site plans, all the drawings and the golden thread. So schedules will need to be agreed between yourself and the building safety regulator at this stage. And then moving on to gateway 3, this is the registration of the building with the building regulator. It's the declaration of compliance with building regs, so which is normally issued by building control. And it's the confirmation of the handover of the as-built building safety information. So this is also the submission of your building safety case, so your fire strategy, your emergency arrangements, and these must be shared with the fire and rescue service. Now, the bit that's scaring the industry at the moment is the confirmation of handover of these as-built building safety information is essentially a statement from the accountable person to state that they have received everything. So someone's signature needs to go on that to confirm they've received everything. And lastly, a submission of the building safety case. So this is the information that's shared with the fire and rescue services. It's essentially a report or a document that summarises your safety case and how the building's major fire and structural hazards are going to be managed as far as reasonably practicable. So this is how you're going to manage the risk of fire spread and the structural safety of your building. So once happy, the building safety regulator will issue a building safety certificate. It almost feels like we're going back in time before the RRFSO when the fire and rescue service issued fire safety certificates. But simple rule of thumb, no certificate, no occupation or reoccupation. Simple as that, really. I also wanted to touch on some aspects of the Building Safety Act that may be of interest to you. You know, some people may be thinking, oh my gosh, how much is this going to cost us? Well, the government have identified there will be a cost associated with some of these new duties, which can be passed on to leaseholders through the service charge, and these are known as building safety charges. Now, these can't include historical remediation costs, which must be paid by developers or landlords. However, leaseholders with leases over 7 years or more in a high-rise multi-occupied building covered by this act will be liable to pay building safety costs through the service charge. There are statutory protections for leaseholders, so I recommend that you visit the government website. Again, handy little fact sheet, which should help. Now, I'm sure some of you on this webinar maybe have properties that you manage or know of in Scotland and Northern Ireland, so I did just want to touch on whether these changes extend across the nation. But as mentioned earlier, both Scotland and Northern Ireland have their own fire safety legislation, which is quite similar to the RFSO, which is enforceable in England and Wales. So the Garnock Court Tower block in 1999 resulted in Scotland improving its fire safety regulations back in 2005. So they made it mandatory for builders to ensure that any external cladding inhibited fire spreading, essentially. Whereas in comparison, in 2017, the UK had over 450 residential buildings in England that were over 18 metres tall with ACM cladding, which is cladding similar to what was found on Grenfell Tower. So the most notable impact of the Act in Scotland is the introduction of the new rights of action in relation to construction products. So the Act now includes a clause to create a new liability relating to construction products installed in residential buildings, which could result in the dwelling being unfit for habitation. So this liability will be imposed on any person who fails to comply with a construction product requirement. It's also proposing to amend Scottish law of prescription and limitation, which are essentially the time limits for raising actions, which prevents newly created claims from being time barred. So the new time limits will commence from when the building is or was completed, and they run for 15 years for general construction products, and this is increased to 30 years for cladding products on projects which were completed before the Act comes into force. So this means that it imposes liability for past acts committed long before this Building Safety Act was passed. The Building Safety Act also creates a new cause for action, allowing anyone with a right of interest in the dwelling, for example, current owners, to bring a claim against the party in breach. And then other provisions include the establishment of the new Homes Ombudsman Scheme, which allows for a new forum for complaints against members of the scheme by relevant persons. This will be investigated and determined by an independent ombudsman, which is also the same in Northern Ireland. Makes amendments to the Architects Act, including setting out amendments to the Registration Board, particularly with regards to discipline, CPD, appeal committees and competence, and again it is applicable in Northern Ireland. And confers powers on the UK government to make regulations applicable to Scotland governing the supply and marketing of construction products. So I did just want to cover those areas. So what else are we expecting to come from these changes? Well, we are still expecting a lot more changes to occur over the next couple of years. One that is rather imminent is the update to Approved Document B. So this is a statutory advisory document that explains how to meet the legal requirements stipulated in the building regulations. And then Part B is essentially one within a series of other approved documents, and Part B focuses on fire safety. So a draft issue was released in June this year, and amendments come into force on the 1st of December, which is a couple of weeks, if that. So it will bring in the requirement of the premises information box for all new residential buildings over 11 metres, and also an evacuation alert system for new residential buildings over 18 metres. And this evacuation alert system is essentially a means for the fire and rescue service to evacuate parts of the building that have a stay put policy, if they believe that it's no longer suitable and the fire's out of control. It also has an updated list of banned construction materials, sorry. So lots more to come, and lots to think about, I'm sure, but I will hand over to Julie to see if there are any questions. Thank you for listening.
That was great. Oops, I haven't got my headset on properly. That was great. Thank you, Lauren. I do have one question. I think Greg's got a couple as well. So the one question I've got so far is, what exceptions are available for high-rise buildings built before the Building Safety Act 2022 came into force?
There aren't any. This is really stringent, and it has rocked the industry quite a lot. By all means, I think everyone's kind of accepted that what we had in place wasn't suitable. The only thing I do want to mention, though, is this isn't going to happen overnight. So although the Fire Safety England regulations come into force in January next year, and the Fire Safety Act is already in place and the Building Safety Act is already in place, the HSE aren't going to start enforcing or carrying out inspections to check that everyone's meeting their requirements for a number of years. It's going to take us a while as an industry to get all of our ducks in a row, but I think 20% of the submissions that the Building Safety Regulator have had so far have made it through to Gateway 2. So 80% of them they have sent back because they haven't met their requirements. So please don't panic and think that, oh my goodness, how are we going to implement this? Everyone's in the same boat at the moment. So it's just a case of looking at what buildings fall into the scope of each of the legislation, and then start planning how your organisation is going to fit that.
Great, thank you, Lauren. I've got one more before yours, Greg, if I may.
Cool.
So this is about the secure information box, where to locate it on listed buildings.
Yes, this one's always a fun one. Now, the premises information boxes need to be at the front of the building. Now, if they're not at the front of the building and they're around the corner, maybe to prevent vandalism or whatever that may be, there needs to be suitable signage to indicate where it's located. So I'm sure that if you had it on an outbuilding or on a structural wall down the side of a building rather than on the building, that's fine as long as there is suitable signage that indicate where it is located, so that fire and rescue service, when they turn up, they know exactly where to find that information. I think English Heritage are going to have to make some changes going forward. You know, the majority of independent schools that we go to, you know, there's always such a battle with listed buildings. But even from an energy conservation side of things, you know, my parents' house is listed and that has single glazing. You know, something's going to have to change and we're going to have to make some amendments. But until I see that, I'm not sure when.
I think it may be worth lobbying English Heritage as well. If you send that information in to say this is happening, what are we going to do? And if enough people do that, they may take action.
Yeah.
On slightly different now. I have another question, Lauren, if none more have come through, Julie. And my one is, we have 3 residential flat stroke houses on our site, but only 1 per building, as we've got several buildings on the estate. Are we captured or covered?
So for your building to fall into scope, you need to have 2 or more domestic premises within each building. So if the buildings are separate and there's only 1 domestic dwelling within the buildings, then it doesn't fall into the scope.
Okay, brilliant, thank you. And one more, does a golden thread have to be digitally recreated for existing buildings?
If it falls into the scope of the Building Safety Act, then yes. Yeah. I appreciate it's a lot to get your head around. There's lots of numbers and thresholds, and yeah, it will take time, but we'll get there.
Brilliant.
Any more?
I've got one more question, but I don't understand it unless it's a typo. So this is the follow-up from Jeff on the previous question about listed buildings. Could that be the buildings if signs provided? I don't understand the question, so I'm not sure if could that be the building in the buildings if signs provided? I don't understand that question. Sorry, I think.
Are they saying could the premises information box be inside the building?
That's probably if signs provided.
Well, the whole idea for a premises information box is for the fire and rescue service to have easy access to relevant information that's going to help them when they get into a building. So if they can't get into the building to get that information, then no, it should be on the outside. So they've got that information before they've even gone into the property. Just think about it from a firefighter's aspect. They need to have access to that, and it's especially important if it's unmanned and you haven't got anyone with it in the vicinity or in the building 24/7.
Yeah, I think that's what he was saying. Can it be inside the building if signage is provided? They do have big axes to get in! Exclamation mark. And
yeah, but I mean, by all means, speak to your local fire and rescue service. They are being a little inundated with questions and information. People are already sending them plans, and they're saying, "Please stop. We haven't even facilitated how we're going to manage it internally." But by all means, if you have a good relationship with your fire and rescue service, then that's only going to work in your favour.
Great, thank you, Lauren. That's it from me, Greg, with the question. So over to you for closing comments.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you all again for joining us this evening. If any other questions do come through, please do let us know. But it just reminds me to say, Lauren, thank you very much indeed for that. That was a very good tour through what is very complicated, and in actual fact is raising more questions than it's providing answers at the moment. As you've highlighted, in the fullness of time, I'm sure many of these questions will be answered, and people will start to understand what is in scope, what is out of scope, and indeed where some of these buildings, where we're seeing an element of scope creep with people either got buildings outside the scope saying, but we're going to do it anyway, or other buildings being drawn into that, which I'm sure will happen in the future. But thank you again. Really appreciate it. Just remains for me to say I hope everybody has a lovely rest of your evening, and thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Lauren. That was a really coherent gallop through a huge subject there, and thank you for Greg for organising it. Just to remind everyone, the recording will be on the YouTube channel in the next day or two, and your attendance certificates will come out this time tomorrow. So I'd like to wish everyone a good evening as well. See you on next webinar.